So this is the lecture on interpersonal attraction. Are social creatures that form relationships with others, or what we call interpersonal relationships. Almost every human that has existed, currently exists, and will form interpersonal relationships with other human beings. When people first come into the world, they enter into interpersonal relationships with their parents, other adult caregivers, and any siblings they may have. As people progress through the life course, they will form interpersonal relationships with others outside the family, such as friends, co-workers, and sexual partners. However, people will not form and remain in relationships with every person they meet in their lifetime. In fact, people will only form and remain in relationships with a very tiny fraction of all the people that they will meet in their lifetime. In other words, people will have interpersonal attraction or the desirability to form a relationship with another person toward only a handful of people they meet during the course of their lives. But why do people form relationships with some people and not others? Why does a woman form a romantic relationship with a certain man? Why does a man become friends with another man he met at a sports bar? And why do most of the relationships that people are in during their lifetimes end in dissolution and breakup? In other words, what causes people to form interpersonal relationships? What causes these interpersonal relationships to persist over time? And what causes interpersonal relationships to end? These are the three main questions of the social psychology of interpersonal attraction. We have all types of interpersonal relationships with others. However, not all of them are chosen or even desired. For example, you have relationships with your mom, dad, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, and cousins, and you may enjoy these relationships, but you did not choose them. Also, many of you have relationships with your work colleagues, and you may like them, but again, you didn't choose to have relationships with these people, and often you won't keep interacting with them if you or them leave the job. Interpersonal attraction is about the desire to have a relationship with others. And so the social psychology of interpersonal attraction focuses on the formation, maintenance, and dissolution of basically two types of relationships: friendships and romantic relationships. A friendship is a voluntary and relatively long-lasting interpersonal relationship between two individuals where both individuals are interested in meeting each other's needs and wants and are committed to maintaining the relationship. Friends are others with whom people believe they can share personal thoughts and feelings, perform pleasurable activities with, and, quote unquote, be themselves while they are around them. Friends also are committed to the relationship for the long term and take actions to maintain the relationship over time, such as making sure to meet up every now and then or to call once a month. A good example of a friendship would be two men who like to get together on Sundays to watch football, or two women who like to meet up every other day and go to the gym together. A romantic relationship is a voluntary and relatively long-lasting friendship between two individuals that involves sexual attraction. It's sort of like a friendship, but sex is involved. And I'm not talking about one-night stands or hookups here, since these aren't long-lasting. A good example of romantic relationships are a guy and a gal who've been dating for a few months and really enjoy each other's company in more ways than one, if you know what I mean. There are billions of people in the world. However, most people will form interpersonal relationships with just a microscopic fraction of this number. Moreover, most people will not form interpersonal relationships with the majority of people they will meet and see during their lifetimes. What determines then what makes up this very, very small fraction of people? Well, several things. The first is propinquity, which is a fancy way of saying being close to someone in physical and, at least in the contemporary world, digital space. For the most part, people form interpersonal relationships with people they regularly encounter. And people we regularly encounter are often close to us physically and, again, in the modern world, digitally. We become best friends with other kids in the neighborhoods we live in and with people we like to play the same online games as us. We become romantic partners with people we work with and who we meet in the same class. Propinquity leads to the formation of interpersonal relationships because regular encounters increase the chances of meaningful interactions, or interactions where two people get to know one another's interests, personalities, beliefs, values, and demeanor. For example, in one experiment, a researcher taught 3 classes with about 25 students apiece. In the first classroom, students were assigned a seat that they remained in throughout the semester. In the second classroom, students were assigned a seat at the beginning of the semester, and then they had to move to another seat in the middle of the semester. In the third classroom, students were assigned to different seats every 3 weeks. At the end of the semester, the researcher asked the students if they had become friends with anyone in the class. The researcher found that students who sat by each other throughout the semester were more likely to form a relationship with the people they sat next to than students who moved to different seats throughout the semester once or several times. This happened because students who sat next to each other throughout the semester had more opportunities to interact with and get to know each other than students in the other 2 classrooms who moved. Because of this increased opportunity for interaction, students who were assigned a seat throughout the entire semester were more likely to form an interpersonal relationship with their neighbors than students who, again, changed seats throughout the semester. Propinquity also leads to the formation of interpersonal relationships because regular encounters cause what's called the mere exposure effect. This effect occurs when exposure to an object for an extended period of time increases the liking of the object. Just being exposed to something often enough, even when people don't even notice it, is enough to make them like it more than they perhaps would otherwise. The mere exposure effect works with everything from music to art to other people and almost everything in between. For example, my wife had me paint our bedroom a particular color. And at first, she didn't really seem to like it very much. However, over time, she's grown quite fond of the color and believes it's a good choice. The mere exposure effect was demonstrated in an experiment where participants went into booths in pairs to rate the taste of various drinks, various sodas and whatnot. The schedule was set up so that the 2 participants shared the same booth either once, twice, 5 times, 10 times, or not at all. At the end of the experiment, participants rated how much they liked the other participant. As the mere exposure effect would predict, the more frequently participants had been in the same booth with each other, the more they liked each other. This is despite the fact that the participants didn't interact with each other very much during the experiment. The mere exposure effect is the reason marketers and advertisers pay big money on brand placement in television and films. Brand placement, for those of you who might not know, is when advertisers and marketers pay the producers of films and television shows to use their branded products in particular scenes. Here are a couple examples of brand placement here. Nike and Forrest Gump, Doritos and the movie Ted, and Burger King and Stranger Things. They could have used, in Forrest Gump, for example, they could have used just any shoe, but they used Nike. Ted could have been eating just a generic bag of potato chips. He's not. He's eating Doritos. Right? No way brand placement works, especially on you. But advertisers and marketers aren't paying huge sums of money for nothing. Brand placement works, and advertisers and marketers know it. There is experimental evidence that it works. In one experiment, participants were split into two groups. The first group were those who watched film clips without any brand placements. And the second group watched film clips with brand placements. After the participants watched the clips, they were asked how much they liked the brands that they were shown in the clips, such as Nike, Volkswagen, Coke, others you see here. And again, as you can see here, participants who watched the film clips with brand placement said they liked the brands quite a bit more than participants who watched film clips without the brand placement. And again, they probably didn't even notice that Coke was in the scene or a Nike product was in the scene. It's just the power of the mere exposure effect. A second factor that leads to the formation of interpersonal relationships is similarity. Basically, the more similar a person is to another person in their various statuses, attitudes, and hobbies, the more likely they will form an interpersonal relationship. It is birds of a feather flock together, not opposites attract. Chicago Bears fans become friends with other Chicago Bears fans. Vegans are more likely to date other vegans, and Republicans are likely to marry other Republicans. Now, I usually have a student or two in my courses tell me that they don't believe that this is true for their current romantic relationship, since they believe they and their partners are, quote unquote, so different. Well, I usually have two responses to this. First, if this is actually true, this romantic relationship probably won't last, and you'll see why later on in this lecture. But the second thing I say is that they probably have a lot more in common with their romantic partners than they think. They just focus on the differences because they are the most salient. Romantic relationships don't form and last only when there's 100% similarity. That's going to be almost impossible. But there will usually be more similarities than differences between friends and lovers. We can see the effects of similarity when we look at heterosexual marriages in the United States. For example, here is the educational homogamy. Homogamy, by the way, is just a fancy term for similarity between people. Homo means same. Gamy means, relationship, friendly, whatever. But anyway, here is the educational homogamy in heterosexual marriages in the United States in the year 2019. And as you can see here, the majority of heterosexual marriages, the husband and the wife have equal levels of education. As a personal example, I have a PhD, so does my wife. Here is the racial and ethnic homogamy in heterosexual marriages in the United States. By far, people tend to marry within their own racial and ethnic groups. And even though this seems quite small, 10% of interracial, interethnic marriages, it's the biggest it has ever been since the U.S. Census started collecting data on marriages. Here is age homogamy in the United States among heterosexual couples in the United States. In most marriages, the husband and wife are around the same age, give or take about 3 years. As a personal example, my wife and I were both born the same exact year, a couple of months apart. Now, there are several reasons why similarity leads to the formation of interpersonal relationships. First, similarity between two people means that there are shared interests, and having shared interests is important for the development of an interpersonal relationship. It's hard to develop intimacy and positive feelings towards another person if you don't have any activities you enjoy doing together, or if you're arguing all the time about politics or what movies you should watch. Second, another person being similar to us is a way that we self-verify our self-concepts, which is a very strong motivation for our behavior, as we've already learned. We like it when people verify ourselves, and having someone who is similar to oneself verifies who we are. And we tend to like people who verify ourselves, even if they do it just by being similar to us. A third reason similarity leads to the formation of interpersonal relationships is because it is a norm in particular cultures to form friendships and romantic relationships with similar people. A norm is an expectation of behavior for particular individuals. We'll talk much more about norms when we talk about deviance. But for now, you just need to know that it is an expectation for behavior for particular sorts of people. And we see norms when we see many different people act in the same way. Also, we see norms when people violate them by others' negative reactions towards this norm-breaking behavior. Just as people react negatively to violations of norms of dress, like just think of how people would react if there was a person walking around NIU campus just wearing tighty-whities. People react negatively when they see the norm of homogamy violated, such as when people see a very old woman and a very young man dating. Now, before the 20th century in the United States, it was a norm to marry only people who belonged to the same religion as oneself. Baptists married Baptists, Catholics married Catholics, etc. However, this isn't too much of a norm now, except in certain religions like Orthodox Judaism, Mormonism, maybe some conservative Catholics. And interfaith marriages are quite common today. It is normative in many communities in the United States that a person should only date and marry a person of their own race. This norm used to be prevalent across the United States, and it was enforced by state and local governments. And it seems pretty normative for people to date people who are around the same age as them. People are pretty judgmental of a 65-year-old man dating a 20-year-old woman, even if their relationship is perfectly legal. Similarities in love stories are quite important for forming romantic relationships. A love story is a set of ideas and beliefs about what roles each partner plays in the relationship and what course a relationship should take over time. For instance, some people may have a love story where they believe that love is a game to be played, and one partner should be the winner and the other partner should be the loser. They may switch who is the winner and who is the loser over time, but the overarching story of love as a game remains. Or there are some people who believe that love is a business, with both people partners in the enterprise of the relationship, and each partner having his or her own role to play in making the love business successful. Here are some examples of love stories, all of which were taken from your reading from this lecture. The type of love story and the modes of thought or behavior that sort of go with that type of love story. Now, the types of love stories people prefer depends on their personality, their previous experiences in relationships, and what they learn about relationships from other people and from popular culture, like what TV shows they watch, what movies they watch. And there is evidence that satisfying romantic relationships are ones where partners share similar love stories. Even from the outside, it doesn't seem that they are satisfied in the relationship. When both partners believe that love is war, for example, they may fight all the time, but that's what they think love is. All their friends and family think they're unhappy because being with each other because they're fighting all the time. But if they both believe love is a war, they actually might be pretty satisfied with the relationship and quite suited for one another. But a relationship with people with different love stories, especially love stories that are very different from one another, aren't probably aren't going to be particularly satisfied, and those relationships probably aren't going to last very long. Just think about how unsatisfying it would be if your love story was business, but a potential partner's was fantasy, as you see here. You can see how those are just so different, how that probably will not work out. A third factor that leads to the formation of interpersonal relationships is reciprocal liking. Reciprocal liking is when a person A likes person B simply because person B likes person A. For example, if Susie likes Darnell, Darnell is very likely to like Susie back just because Susie likes him. Because of this reciprocal liking, Susie and Darnell are likely to form a relationship, friendship, or if there's sexual attraction, a romantic relationship. Reciprocal liking leads to the formation of interpersonal relationships because of, again, self-verification. When others like us and show it, we tend to like them because this verifies to us how great we are. And we tend to want to keep these people around us. It's not very good for one's self-esteem to keep people around them that don't like them very much, as you might imagine. A fourth factor that leads to the formation of interpersonal relationships is physical attractiveness. This is more of a factor in the formation of romantic relationships, but is more of a factor in the formation of friendships than you might believe. Now, for the most part, people form romantic relationships with people who are similar to them in their level of physical attractiveness. To put it in more common colloquial terms, sevens tend to date sevens, eights tend to marry eights, and so on. Now, when this trend was first identified, researchers thought this happened because people wanted to form romantic relationships with people of similar attractiveness. But this isn't the case. If given the opportunity, a 5 would definitely date a 7, and a 7 would definitely date a 10. But people aren't very willing to form romantic relationships with people who are less attractive than they are. A 7 isn't very willing to date a 2, and an 8 isn't very willing to date a 3. And as a side note, for those of you who probably believe you are dating or married to someone, quote unquote, out of your league, in terms of physical attractiveness, that's probably more of a self-esteem issue on your part than objective reality. And because people will date or marry up, but not down, what tends to happen is that for the vast majority of romantic relationships, the two people are of more or less equal physical attractiveness. People won't date or marry down, and they can't date or marry up, so they end up in a romantic relationship with a person about the same level of attractiveness as they are. One physically attractive to someone else. Now, in terms of some characteristics, such as one's physique or body proportions or figure, however you want to say it, the short answer is it depends. That is, the attractiveness of another's figure varies historically and between social groups in the United States and around the world. For example, there are some social groups in America where heterosexual men prefer women on the higher side of the body mass index, or BMI, such as African American men, while there are other groups that prefer the quite low side, such as Asian American men. In nations where resources are relatively scarce, men and women with higher body mass indexes tend to be seen as more attractive, while in some nations where there is abundance, low body mass indexes seem to be more attractive. Some heterosexual men tend to find a low hip to waist ratio, with around 0.7, attractive, while others find high hip to waist ratios more attractive. So basically, people like what they like when it comes to figures. Seem to be universal traits in others' faces, though, that people from all social backgrounds and cultures find attractive. All around the world and all across social groups, people who are sexually attracted to men tend to find large eyes, small noses, prominent cheekbones, large chins, and big smiles attractive. Two actors who many consider quite attractive, Michael B. Jordan and Chris Hemsworth. If we look at these two individuals, we'll see that they have pretty large eyes, small noses or proportional noses to their faces, prominent cheekbones, although these aren't the best pictures to show those. Sorry about that. They definitely have pretty large chins, and they have big smiles. Chris Hemsworth, for some reason, it was very difficult to find a picture of him smiling online. I have no idea why. But I've seen him smile in Thor movies, so it's pretty attractive. Now, people who are sexually attracted to women, well, they find large eyes, small noses, small chins, prominent cheekbones, and narrow cheeks, high eyebrows, large pupils, and a big smile attractive. Young actresses, Elizabeth Olsen and Zendaya. Hope I said that right. And again, not the best pictures in the world, probably from this PowerPoint slides, but in real life, they have pretty large eyes. They have cute small noses. They have small, delicate chins. They have prominent cheekbones, narrow cheeks. You can't really see that here, but high eyebrows, and that's, they're high up off their, they don't have like a furrowed brow or anything. Large pupils, and a big smile, especially the picture of Elizabeth Olsen here. So the question is, why are these facial features in men and women considered attractive? Many would say that people are socialized to find these features attractive, putting a lot of the blame on the mass media. However, this doesn't explain why researchers have found that these features are universally attractive across cultures and social groups. It may be the case that the mass media isn't choosing what you consider attractive, but rather it chooses people already considered attractive to be in their media because that's what people already find attractive, and they want more people to consume that media. Probably a better explanation for why these facial features are considered attractive comes from evolutionary social psychologists. One of the things they note is that most of the facial features of women and some of the men are what we call baby face features. These are features common in infants and toddlers, like large eyes, big smiles, small chins for women, and large pupils. Why would baby face features be attractive? Well, because they signal to others youth and thus potential fertility. The younger a sexually mature human is, the longer time they have to produce children. This is especially the case for women. But how would early humans know who had a lot of potential fertility left and those that didn't really have a lot of potential fertility left? Especially since they probably had no idea about how the reproductive system worked or even how old people were. They didn't have calendars back then. Well, they would look at a potential sexual partner's facial features, looking for signs of youth. And these would be features they found on the youngest among them. So, early humans who were attracted to babyface features in a sexual partner were probably had more babies than those attracted to more mature features, meaning that those attracted to baby faces would have passed more of their genes down to future generations. This means that most of us now find these features attractive since our distant ancestors probably liked baby faces. Well, what about the features that are prominent just on adults, like prominent cheekbones? Why would this be found attractive? Well, these signal sexual maturity or the actual ability to procreate. It was of no use to an early human to have sex with another human who could not procreate. So they needed a signal that would tell them as such. Since prominent cheekbones only occur after puberty, after one is sexually mature, they signaled to early humans that a potential sexual partner was sexually mature and thus could produce offspring. There's also a strong relationship between facial symmetry, which is how much the right side of the face sort of mirrors or looks exactly the same as the left side of the face, and perceived attractiveness. What researchers have found is that the more both sides of a face mirror one another, the more attractive people perceive that face to be. In one study, researchers took photos of real people and manipulated them to have very low symmetry, high symmetry, or perfect symmetry. They did this for both men and women. Here's an example of a woman here. And again, apologies for the bad quality. This is from the journal the research is published from, which is in black and white. What the participants saw, of course, was much clearer, and they saw colored pictures. You go low, and then normal, then high, and then absolutely perfect. Of a man that they used for this study. Now, as you can see here, the results show that facial symmetry does influence how attractive a person appears to others. The pictures with low symmetry were found to be the least attractive. Those that had perfect symmetry were found to be the most attractive. And normal and high symmetry pictures were about the same. This was the case for both men and women, and it was about a point difference on a 7-point scale. So why is facial symmetry attractive? The main answer given to this question is because facial symmetry signals good health and thus good genes. Since parasites and other health conditions can cause asymmetry of the face and body, some evolutionary social psychologists argue people have evolved to find facial symmetry attractive so that people would form romantic relationships with individuals who could resist and fight off parasitic invasions. Now, before you go and start measuring your facial symmetry to see how objectively attractive you are, I want to note a few things about these findings. Look closely at this graph here. First, the difference between low symmetry and perfect symmetry is less than a point on a 7-point scale. Also, the difference between normal and high symmetry is around a half a point. What this means is that the effect of symmetry on attractiveness is relatively small. In other words, symmetry does affect personal attractiveness, but not by very much. And this points out a larger point that you need to pay attention to in regards to effect sizes when evaluating research, especially research highlighted by the media. The effects shown in this graph are statistically significant in that there is a low probability that chance alone would have produced these results. So the effect is quote-unquote real, but statistical significance and effect size are not the same thing. Something can be statistically significant but have a very, very small effect on a particular outcome. And the outcome here is perceived physical attractiveness. Unfortunately, people often don't pay attention to effect sizes, and they end up making too big of a deal about a particular factor in regards to a particular outcome. And we can see this in popular culture regarding facial symmetry, with sitcoms talking about it and apps that you can download on your phone to measure facial symmetry. But in reality, facial symmetry matters for perceived attractiveness, but not as much as people would have you believe sometimes. Influences the formation of interpersonal relationships is attachment styles. Attachment styles are expectations people have about relationships based on the relationships they had with primary caregivers as infants. Pretty much all infant children want to be close to their caregivers, especially their mothers. This makes evolutionary sense. Children that wanted to be near their caregivers and did things to make that happen got more attention from their caregivers. This extra attention would have raised the odds of survival until sexual maturation, which increases the odds of passing one's genes on to the next generation. When contemporary human infants feel that their caregivers aren't close enough or aren't giving them the attention they desire, the infants engage in a variety of behaviors that call for their caregivers to pay attention to them, like crying, extending their arms, or crawling toward their caregiver. It is how caregivers, again especially mothers, react to these attachment-seeking behaviors that determine people's attachment styles as adults. And these attachment styles influence if, when, and how people form interpersonal relationships with others. People tend to form one of three types of attachment styles. The first style is the secure style. This is an attachment style characterized by trust and unconcerned about abandonment. People develop secure attachment styles when adult caregivers are attentive to them, give them lots of physical contact, and consistently and positively respond to infants' attention-seeking behaviors. It's estimated that around 56% of adults have this attachment style. The second attachment style is the avoidance style. This is an attachment style characterized by suppression of attachment needs. In other words, these are people who tend to shun interpersonal relationships or enter into them grudgingly. People develop avoidant attachment styles when adult caregivers respond negatively to infants' attention-seeking behaviors and reject infants' attempts to establish physical contact. Because of this lack of attention, these children cope by repressing their need for attention and attachment, even though they really did want it. It's estimated that around 25% of adults have this attachment style. The third attachment style is the anxious style. This is an attachment style characterized by fear of unreturned affection. People develop avoidant attachment styles when adult caregivers are inconsistent in responding to their infants' attention-seeking behaviors. Sometimes caregivers respond positively, sometimes negatively, sometimes not at all. Because of this inconsistency, these people are anxious about interpersonal relationships because they don't think they can predict if and when they'll receive affection from their partners. It is estimated that around 19% of adults have this attachment style. People with secure attachment styles tend to develop interpersonal relationships characterized by trust and that are long-lasting and satisfying. They don't really find it difficult to form friendships or romantic relationships because they trust others will return their affection and give them the attention that they want. This is the lesson they learned from their adult caregivers when they were infants. People with avoidant attachment styles find it difficult to develop interpersonal relationships, and when they do, the partners find them particularly unsatisfying. Because people with avoidant attachment styles learn to cope with not receiving the attention they wanted from their caregivers by withdrawing and avoiding relationships, These individuals often don't form many interpersonal relationships and often find it difficult to develop intimacy with their partners when they do form intimate interpersonal relationships. Many of the partners of those with avoidant attachment styles often describe them as not caring or cold or aloof. People with anxious attachment styles are obsessed with their relationships and fearful that their partners will not return intimacy and affection. Because people with anxious attachment styles could not predict when they would receive attention from their caregivers, they've become fearful that others won't reciprocate their affection and always worry that their partners don't like or love them as much as they do. People with anxious attachment styles often get obsessed with their partners, looking for ways to control them so that they will reciprocate affection. And those with anxious attachment styles often experience extreme jealousy and often interpret their partner's behaviors towards others as affectionate and as a sign that they like or love other people more than them. Many of the partners of those with anxious attachment styles describe them as smothering, obsessive, jealous, and crazy. Now that we know what causes interpersonal relationships to form, I want to move on to the question of why interpersonal relationships end. Quite frankly, many of the interpersonal relationships we form as we grow through life more or less end. Think about all the friends you made and had in elementary school, and think about all of them you hadn't spoken to, called, emailed, or texted in years. Hell, think about some of your good friends in high school, and think about how you haven't spoken to them, called, emailed, or texted in a year or two. You might still consider these folks your friends, but for all intents and purposes, these relationships are no more. Relationship dissolution is especially the case for romantic relationships, at least in contemporary Western societies. Although some of you might marry or have married your first ever high school sweetheart, I'm going to wager that the vast majority of you listening to this lecture right now will be in more than one romantic relationship in your lives, and the vast majority of them will end, which colloquially we call a breakup. Although we take this trend for granted, it was very different in previous eras. During previous eras, people might just be in one romantic relationship their entire adult lives. My great-grandparents, for example, were country and were born in the very early 1900s. They got married when he was 16 and she 15, which was common for people in rural areas in the Deep South back in those days. They were married for over 75 years, and I'm pretty sure that this was the only romantic relationship they were ever a part of their entire lives. This isn't the case for me, though, and I'm sure it's not going to be the case for you either. Now, I know I said earlier that there were 3 questions about interpersonal attraction social psychologists try to answer. Why interpersonal relationships form, why they maintain themselves over time, why they end. So it seems I've skipped an important part by just going to the question of why relationships end then. This isn't the case. The question of why interpersonal relationships maintain themselves over time and why relationships end are 2 sides of the same coin. Since knowing what factors lead to relationships ending tells us what factors lead to relationships maintaining themselves over time. Now, most of the research I'm going to talk about going forward is going to be about why romantic relationships in particular end. Unfortunately, there isn't a great deal of research on why friendships end, but a lot of these factors probably come into play. To begin, let's talk about the process of romantic relationship dissolution, or the process of breaking up. Breaking up isn't something that just happens on the spur of the moment. It also isn't an event that occurs in just one specific point in time. Rather, breaking up is a process, and this process tends to go through 4 stages. The first stage is the personal reflection stage. This is the stage where a person starts to question whether she should remain in the relationship. The person starts to think about the overall quality of the relationship, especially in comparison to other romantic relationships she's been in. More on this later. And she also begins to ruminate on the dissatisfying aspects of the relationship. People also start to consider the psychological, social, and economic costs of ending the romantic relationship during this stage. Like if their friends would shun them for leaving the relationship, or if their standard of living would go down if they ended the relationship. These costs are especially salient if the relationship has gone on for a significant amount of time, or if marriage or cohabitation is involved. If after thinking about the dissatisfaction in the relationship and deciding it's too much to bear, people enter the second stage, which is called the interaction stage. In this stage, people confront their partners and tell them about their dissatisfaction with the relationship. The dreaded, we need to talk. This is usually an attempt to repair the relationship in the hope that the partner will change his or her behavior to make the relationship more satisfactory. This is where the couple also engages in joint behaviors that people believe can help repair a relationship, like going to couples counseling or starting to go to church together or taking a much needed vacation together. If the partner either can't or won't change his or her behavior, people decide to end the relationship and the breakup process enters the social stage. During this stage, the partners negotiate post-breakup status with each other, such as if they'll remain friends, how they'll split up their property, how they'll handle custody of the children if there are any. Also during this stage, people inform others in their life of the breakup, including their adult family members, friends, co-workers, and, if applicable, their children. Finally, when there's nothing left but the crying, people enter the final stage of breaking up, the grave dressing stage. In this stage, the person engages in getting over it activities, like getting rid of pictures of one's partner, deleting one's partner from one's Facebook friends, or unfollowing them on Instagram or Twitter or X, whatever it's called now, or having a rebound sexual encounter. During this stage, people also create blame-placing accounts that, in order to save face and not look like a failure, usually place the blame on the end of the relationship on the other person. And they convey these accounts to their family, friend, co-workers, and children, if applicable. Now, when you ask people directly why their relationships ended, by far the most common response is that they, quote unquote, grew apart from their partners. What does this mean, though? Well, this is probably a colloquial phrasing that captures the idea that relationships often end because couples who were once similar begin to become dissimilar to each other during the course of the relationship. This can happen for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with the relationship itself, but rather with the fact that people change. And sometimes people in a relationship change in opposite directions. You might have had a good friend in high school, but he decided to go straight into the workforce and start a family, and you decided to go off to college and put off starting a family. Because of different priorities and trajectories in life, your relationship with this person has pretty much ended. It's not that you started to dislike each other or anything like that. You just became dissimilar to one another. You had a lot less in common now. Growing apart could also reflect the fact that similarity is often exaggerated early in relationships, especially romantic ones. To make a good impression, people often say that they like and enjoy the same things as a potential romantic partner does, even though they really don't. And they might even go along with these things for a while in the hopes of maintaining the relationship. But over time, true feelings usually come out, and people find out that they are actually more different from each other than they thought they were. And the couple stops participating in shared activities together and start to do their own things. In other words, they grow apart. So, growing apart is probably really about a big cause of relationship dissolutions, dissimilarity. This dissimilarity may grow over time or may have actually been there from the beginning, but dissimilarity will lead to the dissolution of relationships. Another cause of relationship dissolution has to do with what's called comparison levels. Comparison levels are the rewards and costs people expect to experience in a relationship based on past similar relationships. As people form interpersonal relationships throughout their lives, they come to expect certain types of rewards, such as a helping hand in a time of need or a shoulder to cry on, and to give up valued resources such as giving up money and time to travel to a friend's wedding, for being in interpersonal relationships with others. When evaluating their interpersonal relationships, people will compare the rewards and costs they're experiencing in their current relationships with other types of relevant relationships that they've had in the past. People compare their current friendships with past friendships they've had, and people compare their current romantic relationships with past romantic relationships they've had. People tend to feel satisfied with the relationship if it is at or above their comparison levels. A relationship is at the comparison level when a person experiences the same rewards and costs from the current relationship that he did from past relationships of the same type. For instance, if a person is in a friendship with another and experiences the same rewards and costs that he did in past relationships, he'll tend to be satisfied with this friendship. A relationship is above the comparison level if a person experiences more rewards and or less cost in the current relationship than she did from past relationships of the same type. For instance, if a person is experiencing more rewards, such as more affection, and less costs, such as less time arguing, in a current romantic relationship than she did in the past, this person will tend to be very satisfied with the relationship. However, people will tend to be very dissatisfied with relationships that are below one's comparison level, and these types of relationships often don't last very long. A relationship is below the comparison level if a person experiences less rewards and or more cost in the current relationship than she did from past relationships of the same type. For instance, if a person is experiencing less rewards, such as less sexual activity, and more costs, such as having to spend a lot of money on gas to see one's boyfriend, in a current relationship than she did in the past, the person will tend to be dissatisfied with this relationship, and this dissatisfaction will often lead to the dissolution of the relationship. Another cause of relationship dissolution has to do with what's called comparison level of alternatives. This concept refers to the rewards and costs people expect to experience in alternative relationships. Basically, a person's comparison level for alternatives is how much better the person thinks similar relationships with others will be than the one he's currently in. Can he do better or could he do worse? He says to himself. When people's comparison level for alternatives is high, they believe they can experience more rewards and fewer costs in other relationships than in their current relationships. In other words, people think they can do better. Thus, people with high comparison level for alternatives will tend not to remain in their current relationships, even when the rewards and costs they experience in the relationship are at or even above their comparison levels. Basically, when people think that they can do better in other relationships, they tend to end the relationships that they are in. This often explains why people leave relationships they otherwise seem pretty happy in. When people's comparison level for alternatives is low, however, they don't believe that they can experience more rewards and fewer costs in other relationships than in their current relationships. Thus, people with low comparison level for alternatives will tend to remain in their current relationships, even ones in which they are receiving less rewards and more costs than their comparison levels. This often explains why people will remain in abusive and hurtful relationships. They don't think they can do any better. Comparison levels and comparison levels for alternatives explain why most long-distance romantic relationships are doomed to fail. People in long-distance romantic relationships often don't experience the same amount of rewards and costs as they did in past romantic relationships. Also, because there are other people around who wouldn't mind entering into a romantic relationship with this person, with these people, people in long distance romantic relationships have relatively high comparison level for alternatives. This combination of not meeting comparison levels and having high comparison levels of alternatives is why most long distance romantic relationships don't seem to last. Sorry for all of you listening who are in a long distance relationship, but again, if I have to bet money, I'm going to bet it ends. Another reason for relationship dissolution is lack of equity. Equity refers to a situation where the costs and rewards experienced by one person are more or less at the same level as the costs and rewards experienced by another person. Equitable relationships are one in which the costs and rewards are the same for each person. And inequitable relationships are the ones in which one person experiences much more rewards and or costs than the other. Experiences of equity, of course, are subjective in that most people can only guess as to the objective actual equity in their relationship. Most people in relationships aren't carrying around a ledger marking every reward and cost they receive from a relationship and every reward and cost their partners have received in the relationship. Relationship equity is basically a guess and a feeling, but this guess and a feeling has a lot to do with whether a relationship will end. There's few things that doom a relationship to failure more than subjective experiences of inequity. If a person feels that they are putting in all the work in a relationship but her partner's doing little, this is an inequitable situation that will usually lead to the relationship ending. However, if a person feels that they're putting a lot of work into the relationship, but they also feel that their partner is doing the same, the relationship has a higher chance of maintaining itself. Another reason for relationship dissolution is lack of relational investment. People who think they have invested a great deal of time and resources in a relationship are less likely to want to end the relationship than those who think they have invested little to nothing in the relationship. For example, a marriage is more stable than a 2-week-old romantic relationship because a married couple has invested more of their time, their energy, and their resources into their relationship than a couple that's only been dating for 2 weeks. In fact, marriage is quite a huge investment since it often leads to children, an investment indeed, and most states are common property states, which means that a married couple's assets are considered as one once they marry and are split 50-50 if the marriage ends, unless there is a prenuptial agreement, legal agreement. That people want to remain in relationships in which they feel they've invested a lot is especially the case where the comparison level of alternatives is low. For example, in one study of intimate partner violence victims, abused women who felt that they had invested a great deal in the relationship but also felt that they had few alternatives to their relationships reported that they were more committed to the abusive relationship and wanted to quote-unquote make it work more than abused women who didn't feel that they had invested much in the relationship or believed that they had a lot of alternatives to their current relationship. Another factor that contributes to relationship dissolution is if the relationship is what's called a fatal attraction. A fatal attraction occurs when the characteristics that attracted a person to a relationship in the first place become the very reason the relationship ends. This is when a woman is attracted to a man because he's so spontaneous and fun, but then breaks up with him because she couldn't depend on him. Or when a man is attracted to a woman because she's so dedicated, but breaks up with her because she's a workaholic. What people are doing here is describing the same exact traits, but these traits were described positively in the beginning but negatively at the end. It's estimated that around 30% of romantic relationships end because they were essentially fatal attractions. So I want to end this lecture by looking at some of the consequences of relationship dissolution. There's an old 1960s song, "Breaking Up is Hard to Do" by Neil Sedaka, and that often seems to be the case. Relationship dissolution definitely has psychological consequences, and by far they are negative. For example, in one study, researchers followed around 1,300 unmarried adults ages 18 to 35 for a period of around 20 months. They found that those who had experienced a breakup during that time experienced higher psychological distress and reported lower satisfaction with life than those who hadn't experienced a breakup. This was especially the case for those who had been cohabitating or who had been planning to marry their partner. What helped lessen the negative psychological effects of breaking up was dating someone else soon after the breakup occurred. Now you might say to yourself, well, what about people in bad relationships or relationships in which they are unhappy? Surely ending those relationships leads to positive psychological outcomes. Well, no. Existing evidence suggests that ending even bad relationships, even violent ones, leads to negative psychological consequences. In one study, researchers followed around 5,000 married individuals over an extended amount of time. They found that those who left an unhappy marriage, again, even those that were violent, did not show any more positive psychological outcomes than those who remained in unhappy marriages. In fact, for some psychological measures, leaving an unhappy marriage actually led to worse outcomes compared to those who stayed in the unhappy marriages. The authors of the study put it bluntly, quote, and I quote here, "Clearly, if one of the goals of ending a marriage with which one is unhappy is to improve one's emotional well-being, this goal is typically not achieved." There can also be social consequences for relationship dissolution. For one, relationship dissolution often leads to changes in one's social network. Friends and lovers often act as central nodes that link us to other people in the world. And when our relationships with our friends and lovers end, our social networks basically shrink and qualitatively change. Just think about the people you used to hang out with when you dated a particular person, and think about how you haven't seen these people or been in contact with them since you broke up with that person. Also, in some cultures and societies, people are stigmatized and punished if they divorce. Divorce is very frowned upon in some cultures and societies, and when members of these cultures and societies do divorce, they are often shunned by others and disowned by family members and friends. For instance, divorce is very much frowned upon in many religious communities, and members of these communities who seek divorce are often shunned by fellow members. This often leads to those who seek divorce to leave these religious communities, which has the effect of, in essence, shrinking one's social networks. Given relationship dissolution's effects on one's social networks, it's no wonder that relationship dissolution often leads to feelings of loneliness and experiences of social isolation. And these feelings of loneliness and experiences of social isolation are big contributing factors to the negative psychological consequences we just discussed. And finally, there can be economic consequences for relationship dissolution. For one, ending relationships with others can affect the content of one's social networks, as we just discussed, but that can also have negative economic consequences. Sociologists and economists have found that people often find jobs, work, and other economic opportunities through their social networks, in particular through what's called the weak ties of their social network. A weak tie would be the father of a girlfriend or the friend of a friend. When a relationship ends, however, often the weak ties that existed because of the relationship are no more, and this can affect one's career and economic prospects. You're not going to know that a friend of a friend is looking to hire somebody at his company if you no longer have a relationship with that friend. And a parent of someone that you used to date isn't probably going to be too keen on giving you a loan so you can open up an Arby's franchise. Also, the economic consequences of ending marriages can be quite staggering, especially for women. For example, consider this graph here. The researchers followed married and divorced couples over an extended period of time and measured their income, among other things. And what they found was that income actually went up for men, but declined significantly for women who divorced. And while divorced men's incomes went up above their pre-divorce levels eventually, women's incomes remained relatively flat and never got back to their pre-divorce levels. It seems then that divorce has major economic consequences for women. Why? It most likely has to do with children. When a divorce occurs and there are children involved, the mother often gets physical custody of the children. And this often involves having to make sacrifices, such as having to take non-paid time off of work to take care of an ill child, and that can lead to lower incomes. Divorced men, most of whom do not have physical custody, often don't have to make these sacrifices, especially if they move far away. So that is the lecture for interpersonal attraction. We'll see you next time.